It's been a crazy tough week on the markets. I mean, we saw one of the biggest Bitcoin drawdowns and one of the biggest altcoin drawdowns that we've seen in months and months and months. And in fact, I said that the level of fear that I saw in the markets, I haven't seen since June when we had the big correction on Bitcoin in June this year. But the reality is that we're recovering, and we are recovering well. And I think it's very important that we take stock and we try and look at what this market is about and try and look at all the bullish things that are happening in this market just to get some perspective. So today I'm going to show you the bull case. I'm going to show you why I'm extremely bullish that this bull market is not over. I'm going to show you why this bull market is set to continue. I'm also going to show you when the bull market ends, and I'm going to show you how high Bitcoin is going to go. And I'm not going to do it alone. I'm going to do it with two of the most qualified guests in the market. This is a show that you don't want to miss, and specifically not after the week that we've just had. So let's do this, guys. Saturday night show, Saturday Night Live here at Crypto Banter. Let's do this, guys. How are you guys feeling after that brutal dump? I mean, it does feel a bit better now. You must admit it does feel a bit better now. If you look at the weekly bubble, still most of them red. Lots of opportunities on altcoins. But I mean, you must admit it was a tough week. And I think it's great after a tough week that we can get together here on a Saturday and we can just take stock, zoom out, and look at where we are in the bull market. And I think that this show is one that you don't want to miss, because the two guests that I've got today are going to give you the real perspective. These guys are real OGs. These guys know exactly what's going on. They're speaking to institutional investors all the time, and they're going to tell us exactly what's going on. I do want to remind you that this show is actually sponsored. It's sponsored by NordVPN. Remember, we are going to make a lot of money in this bull market. If you're not protecting yourself with a VPN, you are exposing your IP address. And if you expose your IP address, that means that everyone can see exactly where you are. Governments can see where you are. Hackers can see where you are. Guys, you can protect your crypto for just $2.88 a month. Now I want to show you something very interesting. You all know what a VPN does, right? So I want to get a VPN. Now, here we go. I've got a VPN first so we can have a look at it. So this is what a VPN is. And what a VPN does is, right now you can see I'm connected in South Africa, but I can pretend that I want to be in South Korea. And then I'll press that button over there. And now I'm connected to the internet from South Korea, right? And so all the applications think that I'm in South Korea. Now, Nord also has a product where you can do a double VPN, which means that you can really hide where you were. Now, I'm going to quickly just disconnect from the VPN. So the one reason why people use VPNs is to hide their IP address so that governments, tax authorities, apps don't know where they're surfing from. But the other reason why people use VPNs is because of this. Now, how many of you are actually in Florida, right? I don't know if you've heard the devastating news, but Pornhub is going to be banned in Florida. So that means that you have to pretend, if you're in Florida, you have to pretend that you're not in Florida, because otherwise you can't log on to Pornhub anymore. Now, I know for a lot of you, that's a big thing, right? So to do that, you get to VPN, you put yourself anywhere else in the world, and that's where you're there. Okay, no, but on a more serious note, it's not about Pornhub. It's about watching content in jurisdictions where you're not allowed to watch content. It's about trading in jurisdictions where you're not allowed to trade. All you need to do is put on your VPN for $3 a month. You'll protect your crypto and you can surf from wherever you want in the world. That is probably the biggest no-brainer in the world. Now, with that aside, I'm going to wait 1 second for you guys to go to the link below. You know where the link is. It is this link over here. Just go to the bottom of the link here, and just click that link and protect yourself. And once you've protected yourself, click on Threat Protect and get Threat Protect. Why? Because Threat Protect protects you from those malicious websites where you'd enter your wallet address and they'd basically destroy your entire life and destroy your crypto. Okay, now with that in mind, let's get into the meat and potatoes of the show today. And I'm very excited to bring you the show. I know it has been one of the hardest weeks in crypto, but despite the hard week, I know that everyone here, or everyone joining me on the show, is extremely positive. And I think what we need to do is get to our guests and find out why they are so positive. And I think that this will give you perspective. So without any further ado, let's get to our guests on the most difficult week of the year. Dan, how are you, sir? Matt, how are you? Good to see you guys.
Doing well.
Dan, I want to talk to you.
It's great to be here.
I want to talk to you about this tweet because I know you're a long-time Bitcoin person, and you said Bitcoin 100,000 doesn't just represent a price. It represents the world is gradually acknowledging Bitcoin as the reserve currency of the future. It represents a rejection of the existing financial system, and it represents financial freedom. You've been fighting this battle for a long time, huh?
I feel like an old World War I veteran. I've formerly been in those trenches fighting FUD since the early 2012, 2013 era. It's been a long journey. So $100,000, what I meant by that statement of like, it doesn't just represent the price, it represents kind of Bitcoin's validation in the world. When Bitcoin was $10 or $100 or $1,000, that reflected the aggregate belief that Bitcoin was going to become a world reserve asset or was going to become this new money for the world. At $100,000, it's a pretty good validation that indeed the world has looked at Bitcoin and deemed it worthy to become a new money, and increasingly so, because $100,000 reflects, in market capitalization, trillions of dollars or, trillion plus of value where people believe Bitcoin is worth this much, and that subjective value represents the world's aggregate shared belief that Bitcoin is worth that much. A similar statement could be said of any sort of like equity, right? As well, any equity commodity, any price of any asset reflects the world's subjective, all shared valuation of what that thing is worth. So I think $100,000 was an incredibly important milestone in people's minds of like, okay, Bitcoin didn't die when I heard about it from my neighbor last time. It didn't die in this cycle. It didn't die even though I heard FUD on TV about it, that it was dead. Bitcoin came back, and $100,000 is like this very strong testament in the form of a just numerical value of Bitcoin's resiliency and its increasingly, I would say, widespread adoption and kind of acknowledgement that Bitcoin is going to become this new global reserve currency. So $100,000 is an incredibly important milestone.
I must say, when I look at the chart and I go back to the chart to around the 5th of November, and you kind of see that, on the 5th of November, something happened to Bitcoin that actually made the progression parabolic. I mean, the price looks like it's going slightly parabolic, but it's not about price. It seems like the acceptance turned parabolic on the 5th of November. I think people like El Salvador, Nayib Bukele has been vindicated. I think that, like a whole lot of these people that have been calling it for a while have almost been vindicated. And now the acceptance is also on a parabolic rise. And specifically when I look at the ETFs and I look at the Bitcoin ETFs and I look at the history, this history doesn't go back far enough, but it's literally positive day after positive day after positive day. And the numbers, they're not small numbers, like $500 million a day for an ETF net inflow. Matt, I mean, you're in the game. Like, how does this make you feel?
Yeah, I mean, pretty phenomenal, right? In the game. And I came from an ETF background. I was the CEO of ETF.com. We've never seen anything like this. I think what Dan said is exactly right. I've always thought that the price of Bitcoin was wrong, and it was either going to be substantially higher or substantially lower as a failure. And my view was it was going to be higher. But I think once we got past the election, and particularly now that we're at $100,000, it's on the other side of that slope, right? It was at an unstable equilibrium when it was like 10,000. You knew it was wrong. Maybe it was zero, maybe it was a million. And what's happened is we've moved down that slope where people have removed that left tail of it going to zero. And now we're in the right tail of where it settles between 100,000, a million or more. And I think you're seeing that in the ETF flows. The reason we're seeing ETF flows every day is that investors around the world woke up, realized that Bitcoin wasn't going away, realized it was a couple percent already of the global investable market cap, and they were off benchmark. In other words, just to have a neutral position on Bitcoin, they needed to be 2% of their portfolio, and they were at zero. And so every day they're investing into these ETFs, trying to get up at least to neutral, right? 2% is neutral. And we're seeing that. BlackRock came out and said investors should have 1% to 2% in Bitcoin. It's an incredible statement. I think it's just a down payment. I think ETF flows next year will be bigger than this year. And again, we're just on this slope where we've removed that left tail, and now we're figuring out how far the right tail extends. And that's a really exciting and comforting place to be as a fan of Bitcoin.
So look, I'm going to bring this up now because, that you're talking about Wall Street. One side of Wall Street is the ETF investors. The other side of Wall Street is the fixed income investors. And the fixed income investors seem to have found a great way to get higher returns by going into MicroStrategy. But I've also read a lot of articles that have kind of said that MicroStrategy may be the biggest risk to the cycle. One entity buying up 5% of what to now 2-point-something% of the Bitcoin supply. In a way, you can kind of say MicroStrategy is leveraged. It is a leveraged play on Bitcoin, but MicroStrategy itself is leveraged. I'm starting to get the feeling that it may, as good as it is for Bitcoin, and I'm not taking anything away from Michael Saylor and everything that he's done for Bitcoin, but I'm starting to get a little bit of an uncomfortable feeling that maybe a healthy cycle is not a cycle where one buyer is buying $2 billion every single week. I don't know. How do you guys see it as a risk?
Sure, I'll hop in first here. It's look, Bitcoin's protocol doesn't prohibit anyone from purchasing it, right? Like it's not Bitcoin is not about equality. It's about equal access, right? So it's not about redistribution of wealth in an equal manner. It's more of equal access to the opportunity that is Bitcoin. So if a buyer wants to buy 2 billion, the Bitcoin protocol doesn't care, right? So and if we look at, so on the protocol level, Bitcoin's protocol doesn't care. It also doesn't give you any more influence over the Bitcoin protocol. Technically, of course, money like can buy influence in any sort of category. However, Bitcoin is not a proof of stake chain. So Michael Saylor owning more Bitcoin doesn't give him
hold on a second.
Undue.
Hold on a second, because I get it, and I think you're right. But I want to give you two scenarios here. Scenario number one: there's a Bitcoin fork, and the miners have to choose which Bitcoin fork to follow. And Michael Saylor turns around and he says, "I'm following that fork, and I'm dumping 5% of the Bitcoin supply of the other fork." Don't you think that's a little bit of influence? Don't you think that may be slightly influential? I'll remind you that there was a time when people believed that maybe Craig Wright was Satoshi, and that they thought he would vote in a certain way. And there was that, you remember this, Fud. My question is, if MicroStrategy gets 5% of the Bitcoin supply, if they do, that to me is actually a threat, because they could strongly influence which way the miners go, right?
I mean, miners sorry, go ahead, Matt.
No, you go ahead, Dan. You were going.
Cool. I mean, miners are influenced by the transaction. So the Bitcoin block reward is comprised of transaction fees and the subsidy. Transaction fees wise, MicroStrategy isn't going to impact the amount of transaction fees that are going to be earned by Bitcoin miners. When it comes to the subsidy, both the subsidy and transaction fees, of course, are priced in Bitcoin. So if there are any crisis of confidence of the Bitcoin protocol, that would be an issue. Michael Saylor game theoretically also has to pay attention to what everyone else is signaling as well. So he could signal, I'm going one way or the other. And by the way, you're talking about a hard fork, not a soft fork.
Yes.
Right. So you're talking about a hard fork scenario, which I don't really see a hard fork scenario on our near term or medium term timeline. But let's say one existed. Saylor has to think game theoretically about what everyone else wants too. Because if he tries to overly push on one fork, which we saw in the fork wars back in Bitcoin Cash and Bitcoin Split, we had some very powerful economic actors in the ecosystem like Roger Ver and others try to influence and push Bitcoin's protocol one direction or not. And they were ultimately unsuccessful in doing that. And it's the shared perception amongst all of us of like which chain is going to accrue the most value. And that chain is the one that people eventually signal for. So it's not this, yes, he owns some percentage of Bitcoin and can influence it, but we've had characters identical like that, just like Roger Ver. Roger Ver had a lot of Bitcoin. He sold all of his Bitcoin to buy Bitcoin Cash to try to influence the market, and ultimately wasn't successful. So there are previous examples of this. Now, of course, these values are a little bit different in terms of magnitude, but Roger had quite a lot of Bitcoin. So in terms of amount of Bitcoin, I think Roger's a good example of, even with that money, it's hard to influence the direction of Bitcoin.
Matt, what do you think? Are you any kind of concern around the rate and amount at which MicroStrategy are buying? Can they keep it up? Will it deleverage at some point?
Yeah, I mean, there are two things to talk about here, right? There's this concentration risk, which y'all were talking about, and then there's the sort of inherent leverage, more short-term market influence risk. On the concentration risk, I agree completely with Dan. It's also important to note that there are multiple actors acquiring a lot of Bitcoin right now, right? Which is a beautiful thing. There are 10 ETF companies, there are governments, there are institutions, there is retail, there are people in every corner of the world. MicroStrategy, yes, has bought a lot of Bitcoin, but ETFs have actually bought more, and governments may be a big buyer, and individuals are buying more. So I don't really worry about that. What you would maybe worry about if there was someone with non-economic incentives accumulating a huge amount of Bitcoin, but I don't think you would ascribe that to MicroStrategy. So I think that system is sort of solved by game theory. The question that sort of people worry about is MicroStrategy somehow having to unwind this trade, being forced by a market pullback into unwinding this trade. When I look at how they're approaching it, I'm not specifically worried about MicroStrategy. Their debt levels relative to their Bitcoin holdings look appropriate. It's also never the thing that everyone is talking about that creates a concern. I do have a little bit of a worry about sort of cowboys copying the MicroStrategy model, but doing it less carefully, trying to out MicroStrategy, layering on more complex derivatives. I suspect at some point, someone doing a MicroStrategy-like thing will be forced to unwind, and that will cause a pullback in the Bitcoin market. But it probably won't be MicroStrategy, is my view, and it certainly won't be more than a blip on Bitcoin's long-term trajectory. Yeah, but I would watch that.
Okay, so if that concern's out of the way, then maybe let's talk about more positive things or about more forward-looking things. Let's talk about where we're at in the cycle. So Dan, the reason why I asked that, why I bring that up is because I read this. You said, what's wild is we had an identical price pattern happen in the early part of the last bull run. Mid-November, we rocket to all-time highs and take a sideways chop, breathe it till mid-December, and then another explosive run up. So I take it that you think the best is yet to come.
Oh yeah, I don't think $100,000 Bitcoin is going to be the top this cycle. If people remember, 69,000 was the top of last cycle. We're not going to have a Bitcoin bull run where we're just like 20 or 30% over the last previous bull run's top. The interesting environment in this bull run, it's actually quite surprising to me, and it's very different than the other bull runs because there's almost no FUD. The only FUD we saw pop up last week was quantum FUD, and that one's pretty weak. Quantum, this is a ways out. There's all sorts of ways to mitigate this. It's this comes back every single cycle. What happens is as Bitcoin price climbs, you have to climb that wall of worry. The wall of worry is all these pieces of FUD or pieces of negative news that people are, as the price goes up, become increasingly scared that these negative things could impact the price in a downward fashion. Previous bull runs had Bitcoin banning or China banning Bitcoin FUD.
I remember this. It's such a good point that you make, because I actually didn't think about it, but every other bull market, we have been so FUDed to the point where every politician comment was a 20% dip. China banning Bitcoin was a 20% dip. Anything. And yeah, you're right. I think because of acceptance, we don't have that now.
Yeah, which almost feels weird in some way. I feel it's almost uncomfortable how accepted Bitcoin is this cycle. You've got the president hard shilling Bitcoin, which is incredible, and crypto, the whole ecosystem. But we've got a very, very pro-business, pro-crypto president and Congress, and basically there's not going to be any issue on the U.S. regulatory side. There's no more proof of work sort of mining FUD talk where people aren't talking about that because we've got AI consuming a ton of energy in those centers. And so that FUD sort of died. China banning Bitcoin, no one cares anymore. Tether FUD, was it Cantor Fitzgerald or someone just invested in Tether?
He's Trump's Secretary of Commerce, did he say it was? Well, what is
that's right.
He invested in Tether, just so we're clear.
Yeah, that's a huge, and he's a well-known, it's Howard Lutnick, right?
Yes.
Super well-known. I mean, he's a very pedigreed investor. So for him to come in, definitely is a very strong signal that this is legitimate. So yeah, I mean, I really just don't, it's hard to see what FUD might come about this cycle, but given that there's no FUD and we've got the ETF wave, I mean, the ETF approval for Bitcoin was huge. ETFs allow everyday retail investors a much easier way to purchase Bitcoin. They log into their existing brokerage, one-click buy Bitcoin, a huge, huge step forward. People forget how much friction there is when you have to sign up for Coinbase or Kraken, where you give your blood type, your firstborn child's name, you gotta give all these details for KYC, AML, and then you gotta wire the money over, ACH it over, and that takes a little while. The one-click bind in a brokerage is massive. It also taps into all of these retirement accounts. I can't stress enough how big the Bitcoin ETF movement is for Bitcoin. Of course, we're all Bitcoin natives, right? We prefer that people self-custody, but the fact of the matter is that some people are going to want to use the ETFs, and the ETFs have been wildly successful. If you look at, and I'll hand this over to Matt because he's going to have better facts on this than myself, but I heard through, I think, Eric Ballhaus and Jeff Seffert from Bloomberg that the Bitcoin ETF was so successful that it represents like more inflows than all of Europe's ETFs combined or something. I'm going to hand the mic over to Matt here because he knows more facts on this than myself, but that's massively bullish for Bitcoin this cycle.
Yeah, it is massively bullish. And I actually think it speaks to Bitcoin's core values. You know, I was in the ETF space for a long time. Dan mentioned self-custody. The analogy is to gold. And the first gold ETF came on market in 2004. Gold was about a $2 trillion asset. It's maybe $20 trillion today. So some stories repeat. But people were worried, oh, people are going to hold this paper gold. Actually, what the studies showed is a huge number of people bought gold ETFs, and the number of people buying physical gold bars and coins also soared because it became a accepted institutional asset. You weren't a gold bug anymore. It was normal. So we saw self-custody on gold rise, and we saw ETF purchases rise. And I can promise you that a lot of the people coming into these ETFs are going to dig into Bitcoin, realize the value of self-custody, and begin self-custodying as well. Maybe not all of their assets. They'll probably hold different assets in different ways. But this is going to be a huge onboarding of sort of true Bitcoin people into the ecosystem. We want to see that at Bitwise, even though we're an ETF manager, because it's part and parcel of what we're doing here in Bitcoin. So I think you'll see that. I think that'll surprise a lot of people.
So do you still think that the cycle ends next year sometime around November? I mean, usually the cycle ends kind of like around November after the year after the halving. It happened the last couple of cycles. What do you think in terms of this cycle? Do you think, I've heard versions that the cycle could end as soon as April, and then I've heard people saying this cycle ain't ending ever, you know, one of those like open-ended predictions. How are you feeling? Dan, I'm going to start with you. What do you think? I mean, are we...
Well, yeah, look, every time I say this cycle is different, it's always the same. Last cycle, I felt like there were some super cycle dynamics that could have been in play. Every single cycle, it feels like it could be different, but I think what we forget is that humans haven't changed. Human psychology hasn't changed. Fear and greed has not changed. So will people become overly exuberant with Bitcoin? Yes. Will they become fearful with Bitcoin? Yes. And the price will reflect that. So, I mean, if we follow historical price patterns and we follow some of that human psychology, I think we look at probably like peak price in like Q2. That's kind of, I think, what would line up well with kind of bear market sentiment setting in by end of year, where like we wouldn't be technically in a bear, but be a little bit more of like bearish sentiment. And then 2026, 2027 are building years, and we come back in 2028. But there's some structural differences here. So like I said, I caveated with every time I think it's different, it's not different. But if it were to be different, there's some serious structural differences here. The Bitcoin ETFs, you've got, older individuals who are very good at hodling in their 401k account, and they're going to buy. And I actually think they might be better hodlers than spot buyers of Bitcoin because they're so used to buying, putting their 401k and setting it and letting it.
But do you think they're going to send each other icons of diamond hands, or do you think that they don't do shit like that? Laser eyes and diamond hands.
They're still in the culture. These individuals, I think, still identify with the culture. They heard about Bitcoin in some fashion. It probably wasn't because of like a CNBC, piece. It was probably because they heard about it from family and friends, and those family and friends are texting them about Bitcoin and sending diamond hands and sending hodl memes and all sorts of stuff. So, yeah, I think. It was a really cool point that Matt brought up too, that this does also increase the spot purchases as well. So it's not just paper, it's not just the ETF purchases. It also increases more people wanting to own the underlying asset too. I think this cycle, like we've got a lot of healthy price appreciation from here. Like I said, there's no FUD, hugely bullish with the ETFs, a hugely bullish administration. Macro environment looks neutral. I don't see anything overly negative there. So, I mean, we haven't even seen retail come back yet, right? Like Coinbase isn't the top free app in the App Store. If you look at Google search trends and look at like the Google search trends for buy Bitcoin hasn't reached the peak of last cycle. So if you look at retail intent from like a marketing perspective, I don't think we've seen retail intent really hit that FOMO-esque level yet. And so historically, we'd be seeing more price appreciation here at year end going into early Q1. And then I think like full kind of cycle, to the peak here through Q2 2025. So yeah, I think we've got a lot more room left to run is my answer.
Matt, you're nodding in agreement. So you also think sometime between Q2 and Q4 2025?
Yeah, I think that sounds right. I mean, the trend is intact until it's broken. And, a lot of heartbreak has happened from people predicting that these crypto trends wouldn't repeat themselves, right? How many people questioned October this year? How many people said the alt cycle was repealed, only to see, even Dino coins ripping? As Dan said, this is just basic economics, right? We haven't repealed the economic cycle in the quote unquote real world. People get excited, leverage builds up, and then it blows out of the system. That'll happen in crypto again. So sometime next year, I just definitely think we're not there yet. Where I think the cycle might change a little bit is I think the winter may be shorter and shallower for the reasons that Dan mentioned. I mean, I'll give you a fun statistic from Bitwise because we've been serving this sort of quote unquote professional investor audience since the beginning that is now buying ETFs. We had net inflows in 2018. Right, that's maybe surprising because the market collapsed, but these people put 2% into their portfolio, and if it falls to 1%, they rebalance back upwards. Like that is the discipline that they're taught and ingrained in for years. They won't all do it, but more will do it maybe than retail investors did, which are more likely to sort of fall into despair and then wait for it to bubble back up. So I bet the cycle repeats, but I bet the winter may be a short winter. And then on to the next thing.
What about the short winters in the run? So normal cycles, the last two cycles, we had corrections of in 2017, like up to 35-40%, and we had about 6 of them or 7. 2021, we had exactly the same thing. We had one brutal one, which was about, if I remember correctly, was about 50%, which was a double top pattern. Question: with the type of investors that we have now, with the type of investors, ETF demands, do you still think that we'll see 20 and 30% correction? So this was the brutal correction that we had in the 2021 cycle, which was about 58% before we went back to the 69,000. And then we had multiple like 30%ers on the way. I think this one here was also about a 30 or 38%, if I remember correctly. Yeah, it was about 35%. Question: what do you think of the corrections within the cycle? Do you still think that we should be looking for 20 and 30% corrections? Or do you think that that's now going to start normalizing and we can start talking more about 15% and maybe 20%? How do you see with the new inflows that are coming in? Matt, I'm going to start with you on this one.
Yeah, I think you'll see 20% corrections. We saw a 10% pullback yesterday, so I don't think those have been repealed. But I think 40, 50, I don't think we're going to see that. What's changed to me is not just these inflows, but we now have something that approaches a value buyer in crypto because we've cut off that left tail, because people know Bitcoin is not going to zero. As it starts to pull back, you have people who are sort of waiting to enter the market. I think one of the reasons we had those 50+% drawdowns in past bull sessions is the market would start to go 20, 30%. And you start to see the headlines in Time and Newsweek saying Bitcoin is over, it's going to zero. I think we've repealed that narrative, and that allows there to be buyers of value in the Bitcoin market for the first time ever, right? Maybe they want to enter at 100, maybe they want to enter at 90, but they're not going to wait for it to get to 50 because they're like, I'll never get there. And I don't think we've had that before, and I think that will truncate those pullbacks. But, 20% in crypto is 4% in equities. We get 4% pullbacks in equities all the time. So I still think we'll get those pullbacks, but they won't be as sharp.
Dan?
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly with Matt here. You've got a really strong bid here from both retail and institutions now. I just don't see, that the lack of FUD combined with really strong bid here and much bigger hands, much larger sort of positions here from institutional folks. I just don't see Bitcoin retracing nearly as much as it used to. When in the bull run, it would drop like 20%, 30% in a day. I think, I also agree with Matt's point of like Bitcoin is more volatile than the S&P, so of course it's going to dip. Something interesting that I've been watching, of course, if you look at the option side of the market, so Bitcoin options, implied volatility has remained quite low in this environment. Yeah, which implied volatility, for those who don't know what that means, is basically what traders are pricing in future volatility as. So buyers and sellers of calls and puts basically agree upon a price that they think represents future volatility. and that's paid in the form of premium. So implied vol, we're sitting at like 60 Bitcoin implied vol. If you look at DVol, Deribit's sort of Deribit's volatility measurement. I mean, that's quite low. Like if you look at previous bull runs, Bitcoin's typically in the 80 to 100 range. So what does that mean? That means that what we might have this cycle is something a bit smoother, where investors are pricing in less volatility, but that's not meaning that they're not pricing in future price movement upwards. So, and we've kind of seen that too, other than the explosive growth we had a few weeks ago, we've seen kind of like slow grinds upward. So we could see more of that, to where maybe it's a slow grind upward and just little dips along the way rather than more violent movements. But it just really depends. I don't think, again, to the point I brought up earlier, humans haven't changed too much, and they're prone to be exuberant and fearful. So price reflects both that on the upside and then on the downside.
What about the strategic reserve? Do you think it's a real thing? Do you think that Trump will put it off? Do you think it's going to happen, or do you think it's a election? What is it? An election campaigning promise that doesn't actually happen? Because yesterday or on Wednesday, when Jerome Powell was questioned about the Fed, he put a dampener on things and he said, "Oh, we can't." I think I've got the video here somewhere. Let me just see if I've got the video here. Yeah, this is the video. I'll play it for people who don't know.
Assets that have been buoyant. Do you see any value or benefit in the U.S. government building a reserve of Bitcoin?
We're not allowed to own Bitcoin. The Federal Reserve Act says what we can own, and we're not looking for a law change. That's the kind of thing for Congress to consider, but we are not.
So I mean, that was like maybe like people said maybe that's the first reality check, like that it's not that easy to get a Bitcoin strategic reserve. Is it a thing? Like, Matt, is it a thing? Is it a real thing?
Ooh, I think you have to think about it at a couple different levels. Will the U.S. sell the 200,000 plus Bitcoin that it holds? I don't think in a Trump administration it's going to do that. And that's a good thing. Like, one of the things that kept us chopping sideways this summer was Germany selling and other people selling, these big locked up pools of liquidity coming into the market. So I think we've repealed that. I've been sort of skeptical that we would get a Bitcoin strategic reserve since it was first mooted. I will say it keeps coming up from serious people. There's like a Lindy element to it that's making me sort of slowly increase my thought that maybe this will happen. So I've gone from very skeptical to open-minded, but I'd love to know what Dan thinks.
Probabilities. If you were Polymarkets and right now your probability of a Bitcoin reserve in 2025?
If you mean the government buying additional Bitcoin above the 200,000 that it already holds, I don't know, 25, 30%, something
All
like
right.
that.
Good enough. Dan?
Yeah, I'd actually put it at a little bit lower odds. As much as I want to be bullish, obviously I'd love a strategic Bitcoin reserve. I think the odds are a little bit lower. But I put it above like 15%. So I'm kind of in between like Matt's guess and mine, like 15 to 20%. Is probably where I'd put it. So what's great about the strategic Bitcoin reserve is that it doesn't actually have to happen, at least not in the US. All game theoretically we need to happen is that other countries think that we have a credible reason that we might. As long as other countries perceive that we might do it, then they will do it in anticipation of us doing it. And now we've kicked off the final chess moves of the Bitcoin game. Bitcoin game is all game theoretically geared towards governments and larger institutions buying Bitcoin because they do perceive that it could be the world reserve currency, world reserve asset of the future. As long as other people perceive that other people might think about that, then that kicks off that final game theory. So whether or not the U.S. does a strategic Bitcoin reserve, I think the probability of this year is low. I think in the future, a little bit higher. But as long as other countries perceive that the U.S. might, and then they buy in anticipation, that's huge. And those buyers are massive. So that's kind of my bullish take on it.
What do you think the probability that's priced into the price right now of a U.S. strategic reserve? Because I think we're maybe closer to the fire than most investors. Yeah. So right now the price is at $100,000. Like, does that represent a 50% probability, a 10% probability?
That represents a 0%
That's
probability.
right. Yeah. That's right.
A 0%. Why do you say that?
I'll let Matt chime in here because
If we have a U.S. strategic Bitcoin reserve, we're adding another zero to Bitcoin. I mean, it is, as Dan said, the end game. To me, there's been so much FUD throughout the years, and the biggest FUD that's stuck in my mind and I didn't have a good answer for is what if there's a coordinated global government ban on Bitcoin because they feel threatened? Dan mentioned the end game. The end game is, to some extent, figuring out a way to co-opt governments to accept non-state money. And I wasn't smart enough to see the pathway to that. And yet it's been laid out in front of us, and we're seeing the game theory play out every day. But I really think if the U.S. government is buying 1 million Bitcoin, it's Katie barred the door. It's over, right? We're talking $1 million plus in relatively short order.
100% agree with Matt on like price. If Trump indeed has a Bitcoin strategic reserve, the price is going to $1 million. Like it's hugely bullish.
I mean, the path to getting a strategic reserve, and I'm not American, so I don't really understand like how American law works, but like, what is the path to actually getting a strategic reserve? I mean, simplistically, I think you need Congress and you need the House and the Senate to pass it, right? And both are Republican at the moment. So like, if Trump says, I want a strategic reserve, is it not like 2 signatures and it's done? Or, I mean, I'm not American, so maybe just help me understand what the real steps are.
Well, I'll give a bit of color here, and then I'm sure Matt has a little bit more qualified opinion on the kind of the congressional side. But we have gold as a strategic reserve already. The dollar is not backed by gold, but we still have the largest gold reserves of any other country in the world, which also I find kind of silly. Like either we should be backed by gold or not backed by gold at all. I'm not sure why we even hold a strategic gold reserve. It doesn't really make any sense, but we have it, and we have the biggest one out there. So we currently do that already. Adding Bitcoin to the mix kind of makes sense, but I'll kick it over to Matt for more commentary.
Yeah, I think that's right. People have punted the idea of selling part of the gold to buy Bitcoin. Makes sense to me, right? Why not? If we have this odd hedge, as Dan mentioned, why not have a real hedge?
Fair enough.
The one difference, of course, is there is, in Congress right now, the idea of a filibuster by which you need 2/3 majority to overcome people blocking a bill. There are ways to get around that, but they're like politically violent. So there is that extra hurdle. It's not quite as clear as Trump snapping his fingers. But, look, if they really want to get this done, I bet that they can get it done. That's why, Dan and I aren't at zero. I mean, it's worth noting, Dan's at 15%, I'm at 25-30. We both agree it goes to $1 million in pretty short order. If it that's an extraordinary setup. I mean, absolutely extraordinary. And there are other governments around the world that are thinking the same thing. Yeah,
as you said, it's the whole game theory. Okay, cool. Enough about Bitcoin. Let's move on. Let's move our attention a little bit to ETH. I'm going to pull up 2 tweets. Here, the first tweet actually comes from you, Dan, and it said, ETH is between a rock and a hard place. It's not sound money. It's not the best smart contract platform. There's no defensible narrative. That's why ETH BTC has been down only for the past 3 years. That's why Sol ETH is up 6x from the cycle lows. Next tweet is from you, Matt. Says ETH ETFs have pulled $2 billion in the past 10 days. 2025 is going to be wild. Like, I'm super confused. Help me. Is ETH a thing or is ETH not a thing?
Dan, go first.
Well, we'll play the comically negative and positive ETH in this call. So I'll be the negative. I'll be based on my tweet too. I also believe this. So, as I would say, reformed Bitcoin maxi, like I spent the last 3 years really digging into smart contract platforms, going to NFT NYC, going across the world to like Solana Breakpoint, ETH Denver. So spending quite a bit of time digging into smart contract platforms, digging into how the NFT boom happened, how DeFi works, yield farming, L2s, etc. And after digging into that, that's why my fund, I run the asymmetric Bitcoin DeFi venture fund. We invest in early stage Bitcoin DeFi protocols like Bitcoin L2s and dApps that are in that category. So I spent the last 3 years learning a lot of this from Solana and Ethereum. Ethereum, of course, paved the way. Ethereum unanimously in 2021 owned the DeFi narrative. They popularized NFTs, popularized a lot of these DeFi-esque activities. I think there's always this dilemma, though, with a smart contract platform of trading off more decentralization to do more cool stuff is the easy way to put it, right? And Solana did that. Solana's like, okay, cool, we'll give you better latency, cheaper fees, which trades off decentralization. And retail actually doesn't care that much about decentralization in crypto as much as Matt or I would want them to. They don't, which is unfortunate. So they're willing to trade off more and more decentralization for more throughput, speed, cost, fun stuff is how I phrased it. So on the smart contract platform side, Solana is a very serious competitor. We've got a lot of devs working on Solana. TVL is huge. Solana price appreciation is big, and price appreciation is part of the viral loop mechanic of bringing in more and more people to the ecosystem. So Solana has already performed very well this cycle and has attracted a lot more interest. So on the smart contract platform side, it's tough because there's always another smart contract platform willing to sacrifice more decentralization. On the sound money side,
wait, just hold on. Does this mean that you're bullish Solana, or does this mean that you're just more bullish Solana than you are ETH?
I'm more bullish Solana than I am ETH.
But you're not bullish Solana. You're not bullish Solana as a smart contract network because you think that one of the Bitcoin layer 2s is going to fulfill it, and then everything's just going to be on Bitcoin.
I didn't say that exactly, but I do think Solana is uniquely different. The Bitcoin L2s are, of course, the whole separate conversation, but I think Solana will be very successful this cycle. Let's put it that way. So if you want to say that makes me bullish, sure. I'm still a Bitcoin guy, but would
you cash out some of your Bitcoin to invest in Solana because you think that altcoins run harder than Bitcoin at the end of the cycle? And would you put into Solana?
It's a great question because altcoins typically are your higher beta Bitcoin play, right? And if you're good at that, you can certainly make quite a bit of money. On the Bitcoin DeFi venture fund, so Asymmetric has 3 funds. The managing partner is Joe McCann. The liquid fund side, big Bitcoin Solana positions. So obviously the fund's liquid side, we're very bullish on Solana. On the Asymmetric Bitcoin DeFi venture fund, we view these bets as higher beta Bitcoin plays. So unless I can beat Bitcoin's return, then what the hell am I doing, right? So we do view in these higher beta Bitcoin plays or Bitcoin L2s with like a native token. So I would call that an altcoin, right? Yes, altcoins can outperform Bitcoin, but like you have to figure out a niche in a category where you believe that this is a fresh new narrative that will drive value in the ecosystem. And so I think Solana is going to be, I think the narrative amongst retail for Solana this next cycle will be it's the next Ethereum. That's a really easy, simple narrative. And if you look at Solana's price retracing, it's almost like Ethereum last cycle. Like Solana hit double digits, so did Ethereum last cycle at its lows. So there's a lot of, I think, pattern matching there that retail will make. And then, touch really quickly here, so I don't hog the airwaves here, touch really quickly on the sound money side. Ethereum is not sound money. Sound money reflects credible monetary policy. And so the dollar, for example, a lot of the Ethereum people get wound up in the idea that Ethereum is deflationary. That's irrelevant. The dollar is deflationary too during certain time periods. That doesn't make the dollar sound money. What makes it sound money is the credibility of the monetary policy. For example, like gold, no one can just snap their fingers and create gold. The proof of work function of mining it out of the ground is the only way to create it. And so there's a credibility to that monetary policy. Bitcoin has that credibility. And so I don't think ETH can take the hat away from Bitcoin of being the best sound money or even really being a sound money because they've changed their monetary policy and issuance many, many different times. And so it's hard to know what the future state of the total amount of ETH will be versus Bitcoin is very bone dead simple, 21 million BTC. So yeah, that's my both sides.
All right, fair enough. Matt,
Yep.
Is ETH a thing? Should I put money into ETH or should I just not put money into ETH?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I'll agree with Dan on the money side. I'm a monetary Bitcoin maxi. I think it is the sound money, and then I'm open to developments in smart contracts. So it sounds like we have a similar point of view. My base case in the smart contract space is who knows. This is like early stage internet search, early stage social media, early stage mobile. It's just really hard to know. Everything Dan said is right about Solana. But then you look at Ethereum and it's the leading platform for stablecoins. It's the leading platform for tokenization. Most of the interesting AI agent stuff is actually taking place on Base, which is a layer 2 on Ethereum. I raise that not to say Ethereum is better than Solana, but just to say that having extraordinary confidence that that's true is more than I feel comfortable with. If I were building a smart contract portfolio, it would actually include layer 2s on Bitcoin. It would include ETH. It would include Solana. It would look down to Sui. It would look at Aptos. It would look at Monad. It might think about Berachain. I just think the space is so early stage that it's hard to say definitively what is going to happen. I think there is some reasons to be excited about ETH if you're excited about stables, tokenization, AI agents. So yeah, I think ETH, I would have some ETH. If I wanted to be a broad-based crypto investor, I would have some ETH. I also do think from a short-term perspective, you showed my ETF inflows. Again, patterns that have happened in the past in crypto happen again. A lot of people have come into Bitcoin over the years and then 6 months later bought ETH. That's happening again in ETFs. There's no reason to suppose.
Do you get that? Because you're super close to the investors. Are there? Because I remember when I joined crypto, I felt at $1,000 or $800, I felt I completely missed the Bitcoin run. Same time, ETH was trading at, I don't know, $3 or $6 or whatever else. I was like, or 20. I don't remember the numbers, but I was like, you know what? I don't even know what this ETH thing is, but it's the other one that I can buy in Coinbase. So I'm just going to buy it. Is that the same thing that's happening to institutional or ETF investors?
Yeah, it's largely that. It's the same one you can buy on Schwab, right? You can buy Bitcoin, you can buy ETH, that's it. So some people are going to buy both. There is another element to it, which is professional investors feel comfortable with the utility of ETH, and they feel like sort of the DCF, discounted cash flow model that you can wrap around ETH is like a warm, snuggly blanket. So it is a little bit more appealing to this institutional crowd.
Let me ask you a question.
Part of it is just diversify. Yeah.
Are you married?
Yes.
Okay, great. So if you were buying for your mother-in-law, okay, so when I say you're buying for your mother-in-law, it's an important purchase, okay? Would you be buying ETH or Solana?
Well, of course, I'll take the diplomatic answer. I would buy an index. I mean, talking my own shop.
I get that. I get that. But if you could only buy one, and it is for your mother-in-law.
If I were forced to buy one and she couldn't sell for 5 years, I would buy ETH. I would buy ETH. The reason I would buy ETH is ETH plus layer 2s solves the Bitcoin trilemma and ticks all the boxes, and Solana leaves decentralization untouched. I kind of agree with Dan that most investors don't care about decentralization, but maybe sort of the hopeful person in me says until it matters. And so because ETH can solve the trilemma, whereas Solana sort of can't, if I had to make one bet and come back in 5 years, I'd own ETH, but I'd be way more comfortable. You're making me uncomfortable. I'd be way more comfortable telling my mother-in-law to just buy a basket and go away.
For your mother-in-law, but you now have to choose ETH or Sol, and you got to hold it for 5 years. What's the game plan here?
Well, I got to take the opposite side here with Matt. I got to choose Solana. I think Solana is very early in its life cycle versus ETH, so there's a lot more price appreciation here. I think Matt brings up a great point, though. Like, for an unsophisticated investor like his mother-in-law, an index is great because she can get exposure to a couple different assets, and they're, over time, they're going to perform quite well. So, look, that's great advice for, I think, folks like that. In the ecosystem, for me, though, like if I were to take a price maximization sort of trade between the two, I'd probably choose Solana. I think ETH has less risk, and don't disagree with any of Matt's points around ETH's adoption and that sort of the gold standard here for the smart contract platform sector. But I like kind of an underdog, and ETH or Solana is the underdog this cycle, and so I think it'll do a little bit better price appreciation wise.
Okay, well, I wanted you guys to help me with my confusion, but you didn't help at all. Matt, what is going to be the next ETF that is approved? Is it going to be a Sol ETF? Is it going to be an XRP ETF? Is it going to be I've even heard Litecoin and Doge, believe it or not. So very keen for someone who's very, very, very close to the fire. Like, what do you think is going to be the next approved ETF in the United States?
Yeah, I think the answer to that is yes.
But
look, I think it's...
Which one?
I'm telling you, I think it's more like a switch than it is an individual onesie twosies. The onesie twosie argument was good for Bitcoin and ETH because they're regulated futures markets that allow you to get a pathway to approval. There are no regulated futures markets for the other things that you mentioned. And so to get ETFs, you need the SEC to change its attitude broadly on crypto. You're not going to make an individual argument. And I think if they change their attitude broadly on crypto, you could see Sol, you could see XRP, you could see Doge, you could see Litecoin. You could see a few others that feel comfortably outside of the security space get approval in rapid order. That's what we see in Europe, for what it's worth. They're a broad array. So I actually think it's not as like what's next. It's like, is there a door opening and then a rush comes through? And that seems to be, I actually think that's likely what's going to happen in the next year.
I've heard of a Bitcoin and ETH ETF. Is that a reality? Are there any Bitcoin and ETH ETFs already filed?
Yeah, I can't speak to any specific filing from Bitwise, but there are filings for Bitcoin and ETH ETFs, and I suspect that we'll see that. There are other commodity ETFs that blend commodities. I don't see there's any reason for that one to be, turned back, but we'll have to see. But I do think we'll get that one.
Do you think that all the ETF issuers will still be here in 12 months? When I say the issuers, I mean, there's 9 currently approved Bitcoin ETFs, right? Do we need 9? And do you think that like in a year, all the ETF issuers, is it viable like to keep running it as an ETF, or at some point are some of them just going to go, we don't want to compete in this race. There's no money in it. Let's just get out.
I mean, I really think we only need Bitwise, if that's what you're asking. No, look, I think we'll actually see more people get into the game. Do we need 9 Bitcoin ETFs? Probably not. 5 or 6 will do. That's what we see in other competitive areas of the ETF market. There's more than one. There's always more than one, but they're never really 10. I think we'll need a handful, but you're going to see, there's so many things you can do in the ETF space. You can do buffered, you can do leverage, you can do covered calls, you can do rotation, you can do active. I bet we'll see all of those things. So the total count of firms operating the space will grow, but will there always be 9 Bitcoin ETFs? I'm not sure. We might see some consolidation there.
Yeah, and I've actually got a question for Matt around the covered call ETF side of things. Yeah, I agree with Matt. There is a whole spectrum of ETFs that are underexplored here that I think retail has a pretty big appetite for, retail and institutions. What was the impact, Matt, of Bitcoin options being approved? Because now they're approved in like GBTC, IBIT. I forget on the Bitwise side if you all have options.
Yep.
What was the impact of that on the spot, or not spot, but like the ETF kind of market, the Bitcoin ETF market?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. There are a couple of impacts. Of course, it makes it more efficient because it gives you more options when you're trading and you're onboarding, $100 million of Bitcoin. The traders on the other side now have more tools to hedge themselves so they can give you better price. And I think that's really important. And it makes it easier for people to do sort of carry trade and covered call overwriting, so it grows the market broadly. So it's just strictly positive. I think we don't know what it does in extreme volatility events. I think that's an interesting question. Does it sort of make the smiles sharper, or does it blend it out? But it's done those two things. It's made it more efficient, and it's brought more people into the sort of carry trade because it's just so easy, right? It's just 2 regulated products. It's super easy.
Wow. Guys, thank you. That's been amazing. We're completely out of time, but I mean, wow, such incredible insight. Thank you. Wish you guys an amazing festive season. Sending you guys much love, and love to get you guys back on in the new year. Thank you guys. And to you guys, the Banter fan, that was our last banter for this year. Can you believe it? What a brilliant year. What an amazing lineup of banters. I'll see you guys again tomorrow. Tomorrow is going to be a 𝗕𝗏𝗓𝗏 tutorial. Sunday, we're going to be doing the final show of the year, where I'm going to give you my 2025 predictions. Not the final show of the year, but the final scheduled show of the year. That'll be on Sunday, where I give you all my 2025 tokens, my 2025 predictions. It's going to be a massive show. Make sure you don't miss that one. Otherwise, I will see you guys again tomorrow. Until then, trade well, my friends.